Hello. It has been a long week. Baby is still sick, and so I figured I would just try and give this lecture in pieces, tell you about iambic pentameter and scansion and verse and all of that stuff. So, the first thing I'd like to say is that you can enjoy Shakespeare's plays without ever thinking about iambic pentameter. I know that I did. I first got into Shakespeare when I was 12 years old. I saw a production that I loved of A Midsummer Night's Dream. I acted in his plays throughout high school and college, and I knew meter existed and I knew about scansion a little, but I did not consider it important at all until I got to grad school and I was in my master's program and we read George T. Wright's Shakespeare's Metrical Art, which is astonishing. Made me feel like I am not an undergrad anymore. It's actually decently readable. I'm going to share some tidbits from that. Mostly, I'm going to talk about how can you tell what you're reading when you start noticing what you're reading when. What do you find? I'm going to talk about how to scan, types of poetic meter, and then what are some common things that are irregular. You do have some iambic pentameter, but you're like, what's going on with this stuff? Some common irregularities you might find. The other thing I'm going to say is that the reason I think it's worth looking at this stuff is that looking at scansion makes you slow down your reading of the text and pay much closer attention than you would normally. And if you're paying that close attention, you often find lots of things that maybe have nothing to do with the scansion, just have something to do with the word choice or a repetition or a unusual way something can be expressed that really draws attention to a meaning. And that's the sort of thing that you would just fly right past if you were not paying attention to scansion. So that's why we're doing this. This is also a topic that is often taught really badly. I was looking for videos to help teach this, to have you guys watch, and there was one put out by a TED Talk that said the line, "Of course, most lines of Shakespeare's plays are written in regular prose." It's like, this is false. Most of Shakespeare's lines are written in iambic pentameter. Far more than half. Some of the plays are almost entirely in iambic pentameter. Richard II is one that has almost no prose. There are a few plays in the middle of Shakespeare's writing career where he was doing a big sort of prose experiment that had a lot more prose. As You Like It is one. Much Ado About Nothing. It has the largest amount of prose of any of the plays. Hamlet has a fair amount of prose. But early in his career and late in his career, vast majority of the lines of a play are going to be in poetry, and they're going to almost all of the time be, if it's in poetry, it'll almost always be iambic pentameter. All right, baby is napping, so I'm going to try and get a little bit more in. The next thing I'm going to talk about is how to tell whether something you're reading is prose or poetry. What it reminds me of today is if you're looking at a web page and there's a block of text and you open or close the width of the browser, if the words just sort of shuffle down to make a narrower rectangle, that's prose. But if there's constantly returns, and so suddenly the lines become short and long and short and long when you do that, that formatting is indicating that it's poetry. Another thing that is almost always the case in Shakespeare's plays is if it's poetry, every line will begin with a capital letter. Whereas if it's prose, it'll only begin with a capital letter at the start of the sentence. So I'm going to give you some examples. You can take a look at it and then say, what here looks like it's prose while here looks like it's poetry. Here's an example. Ready? Pause. Okay, you can unpause. So over here, we've got some verse, we've got some poetry. You can see the capital letters all along here, and the end over here is jaggedy. But once the porter enters, everything is prose. The lords go all the way to the edge, and it's made into a block quote so that the text goes all the way to the edge of the margin towards the middle. Here's another example. Ready? And pause. What do you guys see? It looks like everything looks like verse. Every line starts with a capital letter, and you're seeing the jaggedy edge of the line. Let's do some more. Ready? And pause. This all looks like poetry to me with one exception. You guys see the exception? The exception is right at the very beginning. Rogue, a villain that fights in the arithmetic. Why the devil came in between us? So at the end, if we turn back to the page before, it looks like Cusio is talking in prose here and in here, even though everyone else is talking in verse. Here's another one. And pause. It's all prose. They're all just talking regular sentences. I'm going to show two more examples. One is from a teeny tiny little King Lear. So here's one example. You can pause and look. And here we go again. So this is prose. You can tell because there are not capital letters along the edge or in here. They don't have it right justified, but it's just such narrow margins that it looks a little bit like verse. Let me give you an example of verse in this context. So here, by contrast, is verse. You do have the capitalization, and a lot of times the lines that are longer words in them, or the ones that have a speech prefix, sometimes will go over into a second line. They have to have a continuation of the verse line to fit all the syllables. And when they do have a continuation, so you will have this sometimes in complete works if you have multiple columns on a page. I had a complete works that was like that growing up. Usually the second part of the same line is like indented a little bit. That is indicating that it's the same line of verse. It's the same line of poetry. It's just there's no more room on the page, so they put the leftover words on the next line. Here is one more example, and this one has lots of different things that going on, so I'll show you that. All right. So, things I notice on this is that there's all of what looks like verse over here. Looks pretty regular. But then there's a big chunk right here of prose. And then up here, there's more poetry, but it's super specially formatted. And you can see if you flip it to the earlier page, this is actually a song. So unlike the regular iambic pentameter, which we see over here, this is in verse, but it's not in 10 syllables per line. It's much shorter. It's like a little zippy line of poetry that is because it's a song. So the song has its own little poetic meter that's different than the rest of the play. So that's my rule of thumb. How do you know what you're reading? Just look at the formatting on the page. Okay, so let's say now you've turned on your senses to pay attention to when is something prose, when is something verse, when is something maybe a different kind of verse. What might you start to notice when you do this? So there are some general things that people tend to say about different types of language used in the plays. One thing you might notice in the examples we were looking at is that a lot of the characters who were speaking in prose were servants or lower class characters who aren't as fancy in their education. So a lot of times in this time period, characters speaking in prose rather than verse, rather than iambic pentameter, that is showing that they're less educated than the other characters. So in A Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance, the mechanicals, the tinkers and tailors and just shopmen speak in prose. Who speaks in verse? The aristocracy, the lovers, the people from Athens in that play, they all speak in iambic pentameter. In verse, but verse that does not rhyme. We call that blank verse. Not to be confused with free verse, which you may have also heard of as a poetry form. Free verse is something that comes up in the 20th century, and that's when there are short lines of poetry, but there's no regular meter for how many syllables a particular line should have. Blank verse is following a metrical form. In the case of Shakespeare, almost always iambic pentameter, but there are no rhymes. So, blank verse is spoken in A Midsummer Night's Dream by the aristocracy, but the lovers, who are part of the aristocracy, they speak in rhymed verse. And who else speaks in rhymed verse? The fairies. So in that play, everyone who is magical or in love speaks in rhyme, in addition to meter. The different types of characters in the play are sort of divided up, and there's something really interesting about the lovers sometimes having unrhymed verse when they're talking with other aristocratic people. When they're talking with each other, when they're in the forest, then they speak in rhyme. And they become more like the fairies, more like the magical creatures, which is super interesting. In Macbeth, the witches speak in rhyme. They also are magical characters, right? So there's something to do with this elevated source of language that connects with this something being magical. That said, these are huge generalities. Characters like Hamlet speak in prose sometimes. Macbeth is a pretty late play. There are some of the, like, interspersed prose going on in here, but you'll see that especially in some of the other plays we'll look at this semester. Twelfth Night has some interesting prose. Hamlet has a lot of interesting prose. Yeah, so prose that doesn't really fit the forms of it being a low-class character or something. And I think the thing I'd have you look for is, like, when does it change? When does it go from being verse to being prose? Or when does it go from being prose to being verse? There's a scene in Hamlet where Hamlet and Ophelia are talking. And they're talking in verse, they're talking in verse, they're talking in verse. And then Hamlet asks Ophelia, "Are you honest?" And then from then on out, they're talking in prose. They're not talking in verse anymore. And it's like, is prose what they say when they're being honest with each other? And therefore verse is like hiding things? They're hiding things behind their poetry? Or like, what's going on with that? And it's interesting too, because if you try and scan Ophelia's lines, a lot of times they work as poetry. So it sounds almost like she's trying to keep this poetry, but like Hamlet is like, no, we're done with the poetry, like, I don't trust you. And like, that seems fascinating. What's going on with that? Okay, we've been talking a little bit about meter, we've been talking a little bit about prose, how to tell which is which, but how do you actually do the thing where you figure out what poetic meter a chunk of poetry is? You gotta count them. There's no way around it. What I usually do while I'm reading out loud, if I'm like struggling to figure out what the meter is, I might use my hand to do it. I'll just count the strong syllables as I go. So this is Sonnet 33. Full many a glorious morning have I seen, flatter the mountain tops with sovereign eye, kissing with golden face the meadows green, gilding pale streams with heavenly alchemy. Anon permit the basest clouds to ride with ugly rack on his celestial face, and from the forlorn world his visage hide, stealing unseen to west with this disgrace. Okay, so that's the first 8 lines, and every time I was able to get the 5 syllables that are strong. That's enough to give me an idea. There's 5 strong beats in there, which tells us that it's pentameter, because there's 5 feet. 5 strong beats. There are other meters. If you have 4 strong beats, it's tetrameter. Think like Tetris. Tetris has 4 like little cubes. So tetrameter is 4 strong beats. Pentameter is the 5, like a pentagon. 6 is hexameter. There's a lot of Latin hexameter verse. And before the early modern period, there was a lot more of the tetrameter or hexameter. Iambic pentameter is English language convention. So we've talked about the, like, what meter it is, how many strong beats there are, how many feet there are. That's how we get to the pentameter part of it. But what makes it iambic? An iamb is a foot made of 2 syllables, where the first one is weaker and the second one is stronger. This is by far the most common that you will find in Shakespeare's work. But what are feet called that aren't iambs? So an iamb is weak strong, a trochee is strong weak, a spondee is strong, and Pyrrhic is weak. I'll give a handout that will just give you the basic definitions of those things. Alright, so what I would do after doing the, like, 5 fingers hand thing to figure out where the strong beats are, I would probably go through and mark those strong beats on the syllables that they land. So I'll just do that first line. Full many a glorious morning have I seen. And I'm marking them with this little downward slash. And then the ones that are not strong, I put the little U over. So that's what that looks like there. What will you notice here? So, full many a glorious morning have I seen. I'm turning the second syllable of many and the syllable A into sort of an elided 1-syllable bit there. Full many a glorious morning. You could do full many a glorious morning have I seen and have there be like an extra syllable in there. If you were to just say it normally, you might just elide the 2 words together. Many a glorious morning. Many a glorious morning. Many a glorious morning. Doesn't sound wrong. There's just sort of a yeah going on in there, which you just sort of slide together. So that's, I think, how I would scan it. But I'm going to do a little bit more and keep going here and see what else comes up in this particular poem. Full many a glorious morning have I seen, flatter the mountain tops with sovereign eye, kissing the golden face with meadows green, gilding pale streams with heavenly alchemy. Anon permit the basest clouds to ride with ugly wrack on his celestial face, and from the forlorn world his visage hide, stealing unseen to west with this disgrace. Okay. Did you notice that there were some lines there that did not have only iambs in them? Some of them had trochees. So the most common irregularity in a line of iambic pentameter is to have the first syllable, that first iamb, flipped and have it be a trochee instead. So instead of da-dum, 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 you would have dum-dum, da-dum, 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 da-dum. If that makes sense. So strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong. The lines that have that are flatter the mountain tops with sovereign eye, kissing with golden face the meadows green, gilding pale streams with heavenly alchemy. And then at the last line I read was stealing unseen to west with this disgrace. So those ing verbs, kissing, gilding, stealing, and then also flatter. You don't say flatter or gilding. You say gilding. So in those lines, it's flipped. The other most common irregularity reason that a line won't have 10 syllables or won't have 10 syllables that alternate weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong is having a long line. So most commonly, that's if the last word of the line is a multi-syllable word, and the last syllable of that word is not a stressed syllable. So, for example, to be or not to be, that is the question, has 11 syllables, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. If it were a perfect iambic pentameter line, it would be to be or not to be, that is the quest. But Hamlet's not a very questy person. He is a questioning person. If it was a play about Fortinbras, perhaps the line would be to be or not to be, that is the quest. But for Hamlet, the question is the question. So quest is emphasized, and then chun is an unstressed syllable. So if you have a flipped first syllable, not necessarily a huge deal. If you have an extra syllable making it a long line, or sometimes these are called feminine endings. I don't love the reason why they're called feminine endings. They're called feminine endings because they end on a weak syllable. I prefer to call them long lines. That's another common term for them. But like feminine endings, long lines, they mean the same thing. It means that you've got like an 11th syllable or possibly a 12th syllable, though usually it's just the one. What are some of the types of things you can learn from looking at the scansion of the line, or like thinking that the scansion is probably going to be regular first, and then choosing to think of the line as being irregular if you're making that choice as an actor or even just in your head as you're reading it. Here's two examples, one from Macbeth and one from The Merchant of Venice. In The Merchant of Venice, there's a very, very famous speech by Portia where she talks about mercy. And the first line goes, "The quality of mercy is not strained." And it's very easy for an actor to switch that last iamb to make it, the quality of mercy is not strained. But if you keep it in its original, quality of mercy is not strained, instead of contradicting someone, she is educating. It's also worth noting that if you do a lot of scansion, you'll notice that the types of words that end up being in the stressed slots in the line tend to be much stronger words. Most often they're not conjunctions or articles. They're usually the verbs, the nouns, and the really juicy ones at that. If you take the line, "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks," and you take out all the unstressed syllables and just have "soft light yon wind breaks," is like not quite the whole thing, but you get the idea. You get the soft light, you see yon, and you see the break. Whereas you have, "But what through dir down?" Like, that's like nonsense. That's nothing. You're like receiving no information, but with the like pieced together words that are left over. This makes moments when pronouns or articles or conjunctions suddenly falling into the spaces where they are supposed to be emphasized by the meter, all the more interesting. So in to be or not to be, that is the question, not gets an emphasis where it doesn't usually. We just talked about how it probably wouldn't be emphasized if you were saying Portia's line about the quality of mercy is not strained. Strained is the like stressed syllable rather than not. But in to be or not to be, that is the question. To be or not to be, that is the question. The not is suddenly feels like a tangled knot. Not gets so much more attention because suddenly it's stressed. Another place that this comes up in Macbeth is the tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow speech. If you scan out tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, the ands are suddenly like tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. You see suddenly the monotony of how Macbeth is seeing his life just stretching out in front of him with no meaning in it. Suddenly those like meaningless words are getting the stress in a way that is mimicking the meaning of the words. Hopefully this will give you some motivation to think a little bit more about the scansion. It takes a lot of energy to scan a whole play. You don't need to do that. But if you're coming to a point that seems interesting to you, and for those of you who are in my class, you are required to do this, you can find a chunk of text and just go through it and see what the scansion like pulls up to the surface. What can you learn from it? And that can be a really exciting thing. So thanks for listening. I'll see you all later. Bye.